Hello, students, and welcome to Lecture Notes on the Jefferson Era. The election of 1800 was very similar to the election of 1796. There were the exact same candidates as there were in 1796, with John Adams running for the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson running for the Democratic Republicans. The big difference was that there had been 4 years of Federalist policies that had led to a lot of civil unrest. Issues with taxation, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the continuation of Hamilton's economic policies, even though Hamilton was no longer a member of Adams' cabinet, and the quasi-war with France were all leading to issues as they went into the 1800 election. The Democratic Republicans accused Adams of tyranny, while the Federalists called Jefferson a radical, and both sides used personal attacks in their campaigning. When the election concluded, the Democratic Republicans had won, but under the Constitution, electors vote for two people. The plan was that one Democratic Republican elector would not vote for Aaron Burr. That way, Thomas Jefferson would receive a majority of the votes and become president, and Aaron Burr would come in second place and become vice president. However, this didn't happen. Everyone split their votes between Jefferson and Burr, and both ended up with 73 electoral votes. As a result, the election went to the House of Representatives, where each state would get one vote. While the Democratic Republicans had won the election, they didn't take office for a few more months. Therefore, the Federalists in Congress would be the ones who would decide who the next president would be, either Jefferson or Burr. After 35 tied ballots, a Federalist finally switched his vote to Jefferson, giving Jefferson enough votes to win. Alexander Hamilton was also influential in this situation as he urged his fellow Federalists to support Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton wrote many letters to other Federalists trying to convince them that they should vote for Jefferson instead of Burr. For example, in a letter to Harrison Gray Otis, Alexander Hamilton wrote, "Mr. Jefferson, though too revolutionary in his notions, is yet a lover of liberty and will be desirous of something like orderly government. Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself, thinks of nothing but his own aggrandizement, and will be content with nothing short of permanent power in his own hands." When the newly elected officials would take office, Democratic Republicans would hold every branch except the judiciary. In the lame duck session of Congress, Federalists passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. This act reduced the number of justices on the Supreme Court by one and added a number of new federal judges. Once the act was passed, Adams moved quickly to fill the appointments before Jefferson would take office. It was said that he stayed up till midnight on the last day in office to sign the commissions, and therefore they became known as the Midnight Appointments. The election of 1800 would have major consequences for the United States. Jefferson himself called the election the Revolution of 1800. But in his inaugural address, he tried to bring the country together. He moved away from the partisan fights that had dominated politics the years before. In his inaugural address, he said, "But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." The election of 1800 marked a peaceful transition from one party to a different party, and it shifted to a different vision of what America would be, a more limited federal government with stronger state powers. However, Adams was so distraught that he didn't participate in Jefferson's inauguration. Instead, he boarded a stagecoach and headed back to Quincy, Massachusetts. He said Jefferson had a party, Hamilton had a party, but the Commonwealth had none. Thomas Jefferson was the eldest of 8, and he was one of the few Americans who were educated in this time. Only the top people in the United States were able to go to college, and Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary College. He practiced law and was elected to the colonial legislature in Virginia. During the Revolution, he served on the Continental Congress, in the Virginia House of Delegates, and he was elected as governor during the war. In fact, when the British invaded, he had to flee and was almost captured. After finding a replacement to serve as governor, he left public office for good. But his wife died in 1782, and he returned to serve as minister to France and then Secretary of State under George Washington. John Adams' midnight appointments caused trouble for the Jefferson administration in the case of Marbury versus Madison. This was the first case where the Supreme Court ruled that a law was unconstitutional. and it revolved around William Marbury. He was appointed a Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C. However, the letter for his appointment was not delivered before Adams left office. Jefferson ordered it to be withheld. Marbury sued so that he could get his appointment. In the Supreme Court decision, which was unanimous, Marbury was said to have deserved the commission. However, the Supreme Court found that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional, and therefore the Supreme Court could not compel Jefferson's administration to deliver the commission. This avoided a situation where the Supreme Court would be seen as weak, either by having to go with what the administration wanted or ordering the administration to do something, and then the administration failing to do so. Chief Justice Marshall stated, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the Judiciary Department to say what the law is." Since Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court has struck down more than 150 congressional acts and over 1,100 state acts. Jefferson, as president, favored simplicity. He himself was an elite. He was a well-to-do planter from Virginia. He owned over 100 slaves, but he avoided pomp and circumstances. There was no grand inauguration. In fact, for his inauguration, he walked to the Capitol building, entered the Supreme Court chambers, took the oath of office, and then walked back to his boarding house for dinner. Despite the strong partisan fighting during the Washington administration between Jefferson and Hamilton, as president, Jefferson did not dismantle Hamilton's financial plans. He kept the Bank of the United States, but he did pay off the national debt. He also repealed the whiskey tax, and most money that came into the national government was through tariffs and the sale of Western lands. Thomas Jefferson's goal was to promote a wise and frugal government, and so he minimized the military. He shrank the federal government. During the Jefferson administration, the country continued to move westward. U.S. territory went all the way to the Mississippi, though much of that land was still controlled by Native Americans. Pioneers in the early 1800s began moving into the areas of Kentucky and Tennessee. Settlements were near rivers that could link to the Mississippi so that farmers could move their goods down to New Orleans. West of the Mississippi was claimed by Spain. In previous treaties, Spain allowed the farmers to use the Mississippi River, but they began to change their policies, and Spain secretly transferred control of Louisiana Territory to France. This westward migration and the purchase of the Louisiana Territory would be the beginning of manifest destiny, or the idea that the United States should stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The transfer of the Louisiana Territory from Spain to France worried Jefferson. He was afraid that France would cut off access to the Mississippi or access to the port of New Orleans. He was also afraid because Napoleon wanted to build an empire in Europe, but also was interested in the land west of the Mississippi. Because of this, Jefferson sent Robert Livingston, the minister to France, and James Monroe with an offer to purchase the city of New Orleans. Instead, France offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States. Napoleon's goal was to create an empire in this territory. However, in order to control that empire, it would mean that he'd need a base of operations in Haiti. However, slaves in Haiti overthrew the French under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. Livingston and Monroe decided to accept the offer and purchase the land for $15 million without consulting Washington. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory created a dilemma for Jefferson. Jefferson was very pleased with the terms of the deal. While it would greatly increase the size of the United States and eliminate any kind of French threat on the Mississippi, it wasn't clear if the Constitution allowed such a purchase. Jefferson believed in a strict constructional interpretation of the Constitution. He had argued that the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly said. There was no mention that the government could purchase land. He wondered if they should amend the Constitution, but they didn't have enough time to do that, and it was possible that the treaty would fall through. Ultimately, he decided that the Constitution does say the United States can make treaties. The Senate quickly ratified the treaty and passed it overwhelmingly 26-6. The Louisiana Purchase added more than 800,000 square miles and nearly doubled the size of the United States. Following the purchase, Jefferson asked Congress for a mapping and scientific expedition to explore the new territory. When Congress passed the measure, Jefferson assigned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead the expedition and explore the new Louisiana Territory. The two kept very detailed journals. The expedition moved up the Missouri River, eventually reaching the Pacific Northwest and reaching the Pacific Ocean. They sent back maps, soil samples, and live specimens like prairie dogs. Along the journey, they added a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea as an interpreter. And in all, the journey took 2.5 years round trip. The report that they released inspired trappers to settle the Oregon Territory, giving the United States claim to it. Many of the specimens they gathered can still be seen today if you visit Monticello, Jefferson's home in Virginia. The Louisiana Purchase also led to some political drama. In the past, Federalists had argued for a broad interpretation of the Constitution, but with the Louisiana Purchase, they began to more strictly interpret the Constitution. Some Federalists plotted to secede from the Union and asked the British for help. Vice President Aaron Burr was accused of being involved in this plot. As a result, Alexander Hamilton accused Burr of treason. The two had a duel in Weehawken on July 11, 1804, where Burr killed Hamilton. This would be the end of Burr's political career. A few years later, Burr was again involved in a plot to secede from the United States. Burr met with General James Wilkinson. It wasn't clear what they were up to, but it was possible they were trying to build their own empire in the Louisiana Territory. Regardless, Thomas Jefferson heard about it, and in 1807 he ordered Burr's arrest. Burr moved to Florida to try and escape, but was captured and put on trial for treason. John Marshall ruled that they could not convict him because there were not 2 witnesses to the treason, which the Constitution requires. Once released, Burr skipped his bail and left for France. He returned to the United States in 1812, where he was able to practice law in New York and lived until the age of 78. The Jefferson administration also had to deal with foreign issues. For many years, the rulers of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli had a tradition of piracy and demanding tribute. However, the rulers of Tripoli decided to increase the amount of money that they demanded. When the United States refused to pay, they declared war. As a result, Thomas Jefferson sent a blockade to Tripoli. In 1804, a United States ship, the Philadelphia, was captured and towed into Tripoli harbor. The crew was held hostage. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur slipped into the harbor and burned the ship down. Eventually, the United States agreed to pay a ransom of $60,000, which was a lot at the time, but far less than the $300,000 that they had originally demanded in tribute. The Jefferson administration also had to contend with issues between Britain and France again. France and Britain were again at war during this period, and in 1807 the Jay Treaty expired and the United States was unable to get a reasonable renewal. The British began to interfere again with American shipping. There was a blockade of continental Europe by Britain. Napoleon then instituted a blockade of Britain by France. If America complied with either one of these blockades, then the other would begin seizing American ships. Americans were also unhappy with the British use of impressment, where British ships would stop and search American ships and take anyone that they believed had deserted from the British Navy. One such example was the Chesapeake, which refused to comply with the British. The British ship, the Leopold, then opened fire before boarding the ship and seizing 4 men. As a result of this incident, Jefferson requested and Congress passed the Embargo Act of 1807. It stopped all exports of American goods, and American ships were not allowed to leave to foreign ports. The embargo revived Federalist accusations that Jefferson was in league with France, but it ended up being a huge failure. The illegal trade that it produced was very profitable to merchants. It was also very easy to get around the embargo. And in the end, Britain and France were unhurt by the embargo itself. The American people resisted the embargo because it hurt American farmers. And so in 1809, the embargo was repealed. Thomas Jefferson decided to follow President Washington's lead, and he did not run for a 3rd term as president. Instead, he returned to his home in Monticello. The election of 1808 was between James Madison, who had served as Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Charles Pinckney. While the embargo did hurt the Democratic Republicans, it was not enough to help the Federalists win, and Madison easily won with 122 electoral votes to Pinckney's 47. After his retirement, he founded the University of Virginia. He also invented many items, including a wheel cipher, a machine to copy letters, a plow, a macaroni machine, dumbwaiters, and magic doors, where one set of doors would open at the same time as a set further down the hallway. During this period, he also reconciled with John Adams, and the two became good friends. Over the next 14 years, the two presidents would exchange hundreds of letters. In these letters, the two would discuss the Revolution and what it meant for the world. They would discuss their roles in world events, and they would debate politics. Both men died on July 4th, 1726, exactly 50 years after the United States Declaration of Independence was passed. Some of Jefferson's last words were, "Is it the 4th?" Hundreds of miles away from Monticello in Quincy, Massachusetts, John Adams died on the same day, only a few hours later. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives me," unaware that Jefferson had died earlier that morning. The public noted the coincidence that two huge figures of the American Revolution both died on the 4th of July, exactly 50 years to the day that Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence declared the United States free from Great Britain. During this period, tensions between the United States and Native American tribes began to increase. Settlers began moving into land that had been guaranteed to Native Americans by treaties signed with the United States. William Henry Harrison was appointed the governor of Indiana Territory, and he was told to solve the Indian problem. The solution was that Native Americans could either become farmers or they could move west beyond the Mississippi. Meanwhile, the British expected an invasion of Canada and began renewing friendships with Native Americans. Two important Native American figures were Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa was known as the Prophet, and he inspired a religious revival among Native Americans. He preached the virtues of Native American civilization and culture, and the sins of white civilization and culture. Meanwhile, his brother Tecumseh sought to unite tribes to resist settlement. He believed that no tribe could do it alone, and only through linking together could the tribes keep settlement from expanding. He claimed that he would stop white expansion, that he would retake land lost in Ohio, and that the boundary between the United States and Native Americans would be the Ohio River. While Tecumseh was traveling south in an attempt to gather support among southern tribes, Harrison decided to provoke a fight between Native Americans and the United States. The result was the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison moved on Prophetstown, which was the headquarters of Tecumseh and his brother. The town was destroyed, and many Native Americans were killed in these battles. Tecumseh then had to turn to the British for support. As a result, frontiersmen believed that the British were supporting Native Americans in their tensions with the United States, and they called for the conquest of Canada. Tensions between the United States and Great Britain would continue until eventually breaking into the War of 1812. The main cause of the war was over neutral shipping rights, and many war hawks were elected in 1810. They were strong nationalists who wanted the United States to expand and wanted war with Britain. The issue that started the war revolved around the Orders in Council. These orders required that American ships dock in British ports, pay tax on their items before heading to the mainland. The French announced that they would end their blockade if the British would repeal the Orders in Council. The United States decided to go along with this plan, though they realized that it was unlikely to occur. The United States set a deadline for the agreement, but the British initially refused. Though not wanting to provoke a war with the United States, they eventually decided to go along with the agreement. However, it was a little bit too late. Because the United States had not heard from Britain, President Monroe reluctantly asked Congress to declare war. He was unaware that the British had actually decided to comply with the treaty, But by that time, it was too late, and the war had started. The vote to declare war revealed sectional issues in the United States. Farm regions voted for the war. Meanwhile, coastal regions voted against the war. This could be due to the embargo, where farmers lost while merchants won. It could also be due to the issues with Native Americans. Western farmers suffered due to the tensions, while Easterners made money off of selling lands in the West. Either way, the United States was utterly unprepared for war. The cuts under the Jefferson administration had left the United States with only 6,700 soldiers. And early on, the war did not go well for the United States. The United States attempted to take Canada, but failed to defeat the British in these campaigns. In addition, the Native Americans joined with the British as they felt that that would be the best solution to their problem. In the South, the Creek were defeated at Horseshoe Bend by Andrew Jackson and his men. And in the North, Tecumseh was killed in the battles where the United States attempted to take control of Canada. One of the biggest embarrassments for the United States was that the British were able to capture and burn Washington, D.C. While the United States outnumbered the British, the militia ran, leaving D.C. open for British conquest. Soldiers entered the White House. They ate the dinner that was on the table for President Madison and his wife, and afterwards burned down the building, as well as many of the buildings in D.C., including the Capitol. However, the United States was successful in nearby Baltimore, where they were able to hold Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. The battle in Baltimore would inspire Francis Scott Key to write the lyrics that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner. The United States also was able to win on Lake Champlain, keeping the British from expanding further south. The most notable United States victory in the War of 1812 was at the Battle of New Orleans. The British advanced slowly on New Orleans. This gave Andrew Jackson time to set the defenses. He was able to create thick earthworks that had cotton bales reinforcing it, which stopped British bullets and making the position nearly invulnerable. When General Sir Edward Pakenham arrived, he ordered a frontal assault, and around 2,000 of his men were killed or wounded. The general looked down on Jackson and his men, which were a collection of militia, pirates, aristocrats, and free African Americans, as well as regular army. It was a major victory for the United States. Much like the start of the war, which began because it took too long for information to make it across the Atlantic Ocean, the end of the war did the same, and the Battle of New Orleans was fought following the end of the war itself. The war ended in 1814 with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. Peace negotiations actually began in 1812 before hostilities had even broken out. Madison demanded an end to impressment. However, the British stalled, waiting for victories to give themselves the upper hand in negotiations. Eventually, they decided that the war wasn't worth the cost. At the beginning of negotiations, both sides had high demands. However, as the war dragged on, the demands began to be dropped. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war. It returned prisoners from the war, and it restored the previous boundaries between the two countries. Basically, the war would end exactly where it had started. The treaty also required that the United States give back Native American lands. However, the United States did not do this. The treaty was signed on December 24th, 1814. As we mentioned earlier, the start of the war revealed sectional issues. Areas like New England were not happy with the war. In fact, Massachusetts and Connecticut refused to send militias to fight. As a result, a number of these states decided to send delegates to Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss issues in the United States. Delegates from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire met. The result of this convention was the proposal of 7 constitutional amendments. These amendments would end counting slaves for representation, thus giving less power to the South. It would require 2/3 votes to declare war or to admit new states to the country. It would make it so that you couldn't have an embargo that was over 60 days long. It would limit the president to 1 term, and it would say that no successive presidents could come from the same state. Therefore, President Madison would not have been able to serve as president since Thomas Jefferson before him also came from Virginia. However, the timing of the convention was very bad. The convention's proposals came out around the same time as the Treaty of Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans, and as a result, they withdrew their recommendations. A French diplomat said that their position was awkward, embarrassing, and lent itself to cruel ridicule. As a result of the convention, the Federalist Party was never able to recover. The War of 1812 was not an outright victory for the United States. The war essentially ended exactly where it began. The major issues that caused the war were not resolved as a result of the war. However, the war generated intense patriotism in the United States. This was in large part due to the win in the Battle of New Orleans and the victories of the naval battle. In addition, the interruptions in trade led to the development of an American manufacturing sector which would grow over the coming years. Finally, the United States was emerging as a world power. This was seen in the decisive blow against the Barbary pirates in 1814. Finally, Democratic Republicans and Federalists reversed their role. Prior to the War of 1812, Democratic Republicans were for stronger states governments, while Federalists were for stronger federal government. However, as a result of the war, Federalists began arguing for a strict construction of the Constitution, while Madison began supporting more federal powers. He promoted the Bank of the United States, he extended tariffs, and he expanded internal improvements, which were not strictly listed in the Constitution. So while the War of 1812 didn't lead to many international changes, it did lead to major domestic changes in the United States. Thank you for joining me for lecture notes on Jefferson-era America.